This is a Dutch test report tutorial. These educational videos are not intended to be taken as any sort of medical advice. We're going to show you an example set of results here and then talk you through a situation that's similar to yours, but there are no results on the screen here that are from an actual patient set of results. So we've got a lot of data to look at as it relates to cortisol, but we want to focus mostly on the free cortisol pattern. So free cortisol measured multiple times throughout the day. That's an important measurement. We're looking at one that's taken from the waking sample, so that doesn't reflect cortisol at waking. That reflects the night's collection and the night's production of that free cortisol. Then we've got another collection 2 hours later. Typically there's a big surge of cortisol in these first 2 hours of the day, and that's what we're trying to see there. And then another measurement around dinner time that shows that late afternoon cortisol, and then one around bedtime. So we're going to take those four measurements and then add them up to give the daily total of free or circulating cortisol. In this particular case, it looks like those values are extremely low. So in that case, that's concerning. We want to look a little bit further, and one of the things we want to do is, instead of just basing the overall picture on that free cortisol, we also want to look at metabolized cortisol. Metabolized cortisol is really the best marker of the total glandular output of cortisol. So when we look at that in this particular case, it's not quite as extremely low as the free cortisol seems to be, but it does confirm that there's a pretty low output of cortisol. In some cases, when the cortisol is extremely low, doctors may want to go on and do a confirmatory test to make sure that the patient doesn't have Addison's disease, which is a condition in which the adrenal gland just doesn't respond when it's signaled by the brain. The brain sends ACTH to the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal gland is supposed to make cortisol following that. If that's not happening, then that's a significant issue, and when the cortisol is as low as it is in this case, it might be worth ruling that out in some cases. So the cortisol, when it's made from the adrenal gland, is then interconverted between cortisol, which is its active form, and cortisone, which is its inactive form, by an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD. So you can see that depicted down here at the bottom with this two-way arrow, that the cortisol and cortisone go back and forth and back and forth. So because it goes back and forth a little bit, and in some cases quite significantly, we also want to measure the free cortisone. So this is of secondary importance, but it should have a similar pattern often to the free cortisol, and it can help shape that picture a little bit. So in a case like this, where the free cortisol is so extremely low, we're really just looking for confirmation of that from the free cortisone pattern. So there's a back and forth metabolism that goes on between these hormones, and then they're ultimately metabolized to their terminal metabolites for excretion. So tetrahydrocortisol, tetrahydrocortisone, these are long named metabolites, but they're essentially just the end product that's ready for excretion, and that process is irreversible. So once it goes down that way, it's gone. So in some situations you might see where the cortisol production is a lot higher than what the free cortisol might imply. So in that case, it seems that there's increased cortisol metabolism, which you'll see in cases of obesity, high thyroid, maybe a situation where there's been long-term exposure to cortisol via stress or to other glucocorticoids via supplementation. In those situations, the metabolism of cortisol can be upregulated. On the other side of things, if the thyroid function is low, if the liver function is low, there might be somewhat sluggish cortisol clearance, which is going to back up that free cortisol and show lower levels of those metabolites. So the other thing we might want to assess when looking at the difference between cortisol and cortisone, as we look at those two patterns, is whether there is an overall preference for deactivating cortisol, or whether there's a preference that's opposite of keeping the cortisol in its active form. The best way to look at that is not necessarily to look at the free cortisol and free cortisone. The best way to look at that is to look at the metabolites. The free hormones only represent about 1, 2, maybe 3% of the total, whereas the metabolites represent a large majority of them. So when we want to know systemically and overall throughout the day which is dominating really, the inactive cortisone or the active cortisol? That's where we want to look at this index. So if it favors more towards cortisol, then the patient's really hanging on to that cortisol, which might make sense in a case like this because the levels are so very low. If on the other hand, there's a deactivation, that may be part of the reason for lower levels of free cortisol is a heavy deactivation. When the results are much higher across the board, that might be a compensatory mechanism to get rid of a lot of excess cortisol. In this case, obviously there's an overall deficiency in cortisol, so we want to look at the overall picture. The free hormone over time, the total of the production, and then any metabolism preference that there might be. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have questions, please do refer those back to your provider, and you can also learn more from other educational videos at DutchTest.com.